Thank you very much and welcome back. So for our second session focusing on space deterrence and integrated deterrence, I am very pleased to say we're going to be looking even higher towards the stars. And what better way to start this session than to welcome the 4-star Commander of Space Operations in the United States of America, General Chance Saltzman. Welcome.
Wow, this is a distinguished group again. I enjoyed last year so much I thought I'd come back when the weather was better, so thanks for all of that. Thanks, Susanna, for that kind introduction. Thanks to everyone here at GASC that helped makes this important conversation possible. And it's going to be my honor later to share the stage with Generals Novak and Tedman. So thanks for indulging me with your patience while I try to set the stage for this important conversation. And to my fellow Air and Space Chiefs, as well as the academic and industry leaders gathered here today, thank you for being here, and I look forward to sharing ideas on deterrence with you. Now, when I was a young officer, I could not understand deterrence. But now, after many years of education, experience, and intense mentoring, I can assure you I am no longer a young officer. So let me apologize in advance to the non-history buffs in the room as I'm going to dive into the history of deterrence in an attempt to contextualize the challenges we are currently facing and applying them to the concept of space. So hang in there. I think it's going to help us chart a way forward. Let me start with the earliest discussions of deterrence as a concept. And by early, I mean 2,500 years ago, to that famous Athenian general and historian Thucydides. I know. I said bear with me, right? I get to say anything I want now. All right. In the history of the Peloponnesian War, Thucydides describes no less than 10 uses of what he called a deterrence strategy. And that was the conflict between Athens and Sparta. And aside from one partial exception, they all failed spectacularly. In fact, in most cases, they primarily served to provoke the exact behavior they were meant to prevent. Yet here we are today at a panel called Space Deterrence and Integrated Deterrence. What I intend to do is attempt to address two fundamental questions. First, is deterrence a suitable military construct to help us deliver forces needed to meet security objectives, particularly in space? And second, are there limits to what can be deterred? Historically speaking, deterrence has rarely been a major element of military strategy until the modern era. But now our strategies are riddled with terms like nuclear deterrence, strategic deterrence, conventional deterrence, minimum deterrence, extended deterrence, and as we see here today, space and integrated deterrence. And presumably, each of these serves different strategic objectives. So what's changed? Well, in short, I contend what has changed is nuclear weapons. The root of what we understand today as deterrence grew from the decisive application of nuclear weapons in World War II. In 1959, Bernard Brodie, one of the foremost civilian military strategists of his era, published Strategy in the Missile Age. And this seminal book, now 65 years old, became the foundational text for deterrence as a modern strategy. In its pages, Brodie encouraged military leaders to think about the unthinkable, to confront the threat of nuclear war, and to carefully consider the realities of deterrence in the dawning of the nuclear age. Deterrence, he wrote, now means something as a strategic policy only when we are fairly confident that the retaliatory instrument upon which it relies will not be called upon to function at all. In short, we expect the system to be always ready to spring while going permanently unused. And Brodie's work drove the reemergence of the term and popularized deterrence in the modern context. The word itself is an appropriate one, derived from the Latin for terrible or terrifying, signifying that to deter is to frighten away. But the deterrence of Brodie had little in common with the deterrence of Thucydides. As Brodie wrote, what was distinctively new about deterrence in the atomic age was the degree to which it was intolerable should it fail. Deterrence in his mind was a threshold condition. On one side, a state of stability. On the other side, a state of intolerable devastation. So to the first question, is this a suitable construct for us to use? Over the course of my career, I've come to the conclusion that deterrence is really is a term of policy best used to capture an ideal outcome of grand strategy. This is why I believe integrated deterrence is a valuable and worthy approach in the U.S.'s national defense strategy. Our NDS describes it as a weaving together of capabilities and concepts with those of our international and interagency partners to dissuade aggression. In other words, a whole of government and an international approach as a grand strategy in pursuit of an ideal set of security outcomes. But with that said, we should recognize that militaries only play a supporting role in this strategy, and we must provide the proper support if we're to achieve the desired outcome. As Air and Space Chiefs, we owe it to our national decision makers to focus on creating operational realities that can help derive this desired outcome. For those of us in uniform, our goal must be to assist in deterrence by taking actions that are far more tangible. We must remember that deterrence lives in the mind of an adversary, and therefore figuring out which forces are needed to affect a mental calculus can be and is subjective and problematic. Therefore, I contend that we shouldn't think about building forces to deter. We should build forces to attack and defend. And if we do this properly, it will help our national leaders create the conditions of deterrence. And for those of you thinking that this is a difference without a distinction, I'm asking you to consider the science of our profession, not the art of its employment. Consider this. Imagine being asked to deter a missile attack. Soon, the mind begins to boggle with all of the pros and cons of conducting the attack, factors that might enhance the penalties, downplay the benefits. How best to alter another decision's calculus when we have probably limited insights into the motivations, constraints, and restraints? This is problematic. Now consider being asked to defend against a missile attack. The questions that come to mind are more quantifiable. How many missiles? On what trajectory? Altitude? Speed? What's their target? Can we use technology to intercept the missile in flight? Can I harden or hide the target to negate the missile's effect? The science of this operational challenge is knowable, definable, and it's not as difficult to conceive of activities to accomplish this mission. The art of influencing the adversary to not take the action to begin with is much harder to quantify and translate into mission-oriented activities, and even in so doing, it is infinitely dynamic in time and place, mostly guesswork, and therefore unsuited to effectively determine our force designs. Again, this is not a repudiation of deterrence as a policy or even a grand strategy. Quite the contrary. I think it is the most desirable end state for any national security apparatus. But we must do our part. As Air and Space Service Chiefs, we must focus on the military specifics of that national security apparatus. In other words, we must organize, train, and equip forces that can provide offensive and defensive capabilities and capacities that punish aggressors and protect and defend our national interests. In designing these capabilities, we must focus on the D verbs of military action: deny, degrade, disrupt, and destroy, and avoid deter as an action for military forces due to its inherent ambiguities. If we do this right, the net result is a condition of deterrence that maintains a safe, secure, and stable international environment, which is the ultimate goal of our national security policy. To summarize the answer to the first question, I'll say that deterrence is well suited to grand strategy or as a policy end, but less suitable as a construct to help militaries effectively organize, train, and equip. Now let's turn to the second question. Are there limits to what can be deterred? To start, remember what I said about Brody's view of deterrence. In his view, only when the most severe consequences are assured and well understood can we truly achieve deterrence. Strategic nuclear weapons are therefore a singular example because all else pales into insignificance in the face of annihilation. That same level of certainty simply does not exist for other sets of military conditions. Another key consideration in determining what can be deterred is noting that we have an intrinsic understanding that rational actors will not respond disproportionately to a non-nuclear attack. Would a cyber attack or a downing of an RPA drive a nuclear response? Hasn't yet. I think it's highly unlikely to in the future. This is the essence of deterrence theory, nuclear attacks being reserved for only existential interests, and with assurance of nuclear counterstrike, a state of nuclear deterrence exists between nuclear powers. The problem is that strategic stability that this creates makes it an attractive logic to apply elsewhere. Since 1945, we've experienced cycle after cycle of escalation and de-escalation. Time and again, when factored, nuclear weapons have served as a tool of political exchange. And no matter how close we've come to the brink, they have not been used again. This evolution has conditioned us to normalize and even extend nuclear deterrence logic beyond its practical limits. We have allowed deterrence as a concept to morph from a very specific existential edge case into a caricature, an overly simplistic logical reduction of the theory. Today, all too often, there is a view in military circles that deterrence is a cost-benefit calculus that can be manipulated to preclude or dictate an adversary's actions. In short, we've led ourselves to conclude and believe that we can use military logic of nuclear deterrence to be more broadly applied. Bit by bit, we have subconsciously absorbed the notion that if done right, we can use military force to deter all sorts of actions that run counter to our national interests. But in practice, as we have seen, there are limits to deterrence. So in determining where these limits are, perhaps, it's necessary to first describe the characteristics of effective deterrence. I would propose that there are three broad characteristics. First, there must exist credible capabilities to conduct activities that deny benefits and impose costs. Second, these capabilities must be observable in order to establish sufficient credibility. And finally, the consequences of action must be unambiguous, unacceptable, and clearly put the aggressor at a disadvantage. The difficulties created by the subjectivity of ambiguity, acceptability, and clarity brings us right back to Thucydides. In his histories, Thucydides observed that nations go to war for three fundamental reasons: fear, honor, and interest, which is a useful insight, but does little to help us predict the future, because the manifestation of these and the pressures, influence, and intensity that they bring are extremely sensitive to circumstance and very dynamic in their interaction. When honor is at stake, national leaders may accept unanticipated amounts of risk, and they may actually welcome threats to enable them to demonstrate courage. Honor is incredibly cultural. It is never easy to guarantee the forms that honor might take or the lengths to which an actor will take to secure it. When fear is the prime motivator, assessments of consequence become skewed. Leaders can rationalize that compliance or appeasement is far more costly than resistance, even if that does not seem to be the case from an external or third-party viewpoint. But of the three, interest is by far the hardest to measure effectively. Even if one nation can understand the interests of another, there is very little chance that it will value them in the same way. If we struggle enough to understand our own underlying motivations, do we believe that we can accurately calculate the resources an adversary will commit to secure a benefit? More to the point, would we value denying that benefit so much so that we would commit the same level of resources? What Thucydides unknowingly instructs us on is that fear, honor, and interest are inherently tough to assess because of extreme subjectivity in the concepts of ambiguity, acceptability, and clarity. The third defining characteristic of effective deterrence eludes us. Trying to guess or interpret how an adversary may act, therefore, can muddy military decision-making and create room for speculation and error. All too often, rigorous assessment can give way to wishful thinking. So nuclear weapons are the exception rather than the rule because they eliminate all ambiguity and replace it with a cold certainty. Fear of assured and devastating destruction trumps all else. And that's why nuclear deterrence, and only nuclear deterrence, has a record of spectacular success. To summarize the answer to the second question, nuclear attacks can be deterred by a nuclear-armed nation. However, because of the challenge of meeting this third characteristic of deterrence, unambiguity, unacceptability, and the clear disadvantage to an aggressor, extending deterrence to other military circumstances has serious limitations. Again, I want to emphasize, and I only mean limitations in the sense of being a guiding light for organizing, training, and equipping military forces. Deterrence in grand strategy and describing ideal national security end states is valuable and worthwhile. In contrast, the extension of the logic from nuclear to non-nuclear deterrence is suspect from a military perspective, particularly when you try to imagine what deterrence in space might look like. So now that I've laid out the broader point in excruciating detail, let's narrow the focus to the space domain. Here the key question is, can we deter an attack on space assets? I hope after that extended preamble, you understand why I say a better question for military leaders is how do we defend against an attack on space assets? Or a broader question, how do we protect our interests in, from, and to space? And when I was a young space operator, the space domain was largely benign. So we focused on assured access with launch and ground networks and optimizing space missions that supported other forces, like with communication, precision navigation and timing, ISR. But now, threats to these capabilities have been fielded, and we recognize now that we will have to contest the space domain in order to use it effectively. And this relatively new mission of space superiority will mirror air superiority as it seeks to protect our capabilities and deny the adversary the use of theirs. In the U.S. Space Force, to accomplish the mission of space superiority, we have proposed a theory of success called competitive endurance. This theory includes three key tenets: avoiding operational surprise, denying first mover advantage, and conducting responsible counterspace activities. And this theory is key because these key tenets guide us in all the supporting decisions that must be made. For example, what systems do we need to disrupt or deny an adversary's space-based targeting? What training do our operators need to counter adversary tactics? How do we enhance mission resiliency in a cost-effective way? How do we fuse data on an operationally relevant timeline to avoid surprise? In short, the tenets help us organize, train, and equip to perform specific military activities rather than pursue a more esoteric concept like deterrence. The success of competitive endurance comes when our forces can anticipate aggression, protect our space missions, deny, degrade, disrupt an adversary's space capabilities. Now, obviously, we believe if we do these things effectively, we will contribute to the broader efforts to maintain an effective state of deterrence. But rather than organizing, training, and equipping to deter, we do it to accomplish specific military missions. The U.S. Space Force's approach acknowledges that we cannot be expected to deter all disagreeable, concerning, or aggressive behaviors. But we will be able to react and respond in a manner that preserves a stable security environment, discouraging more drastic behaviors. And this back and forth constitutes great power competition. And maintaining a state of competition with adversarial nations is far more preferable to crisis or conflict. And competitive endurance strives to promote stability. Now back to the history. In his study of major wars that shaped international order up to World War II, military strategist Captain B.H. Littleheart found that only 2% of battles were won as a result of a direct attack, and even then at great cost. Indirect attacks, misdirection, and what he called the power of endurance to last, all far more effective in successful campaigns against a near-peer adversary. That power of endurance to last is very much at the heart of competitive endurance, and it is enhanced and sustained by an interconnected web of capabilities designed to protect and defend. It is for this reason, precisely, that we value our alliances and partnerships so dearly. Only by working together can we truly achieve the endurance required to implement competitive endurance over the long years ahead. Fortunately, our allies and partners remain an unparalleled source of enduring strength and competitive advantage, particularly in the domain of space. And this is not just a good idea, it's part of U.S. policy. Our classified space security guidance issued in June of 2023 directs the U.S. to increase integration with allies and partners on space activities, operations, plans, capabilities, and information sharing for mutual benefit in response to growing space and counterspace threats and to protect U.S. forces from hostile uses of space. The United States is proud to be a part of an ever-growing group of allies and partners, many of them in the room today. A group of partners that are all working together to increase resiliency, redundancy, and interoperability of all space-based capabilities to enhance our collective security. Along these lines, we endeavor to lead efforts in the responsible, peaceful, and sustainable uses of space. And this includes promoting international norms of responsible behavior. Let me give you some examples of what I'm describing. In 2023, we conducted the first bilateral space cooperation dialogue with the Indian Ministry of Defense. We advanced discussions with our Japanese partners on finalizing our unique space domain awareness hosted payload partnership. Collaboration between the U.S. and Norway enabled the integration of U.S. payloads onto 2 Norwegian satellites to provide 24/7 protected satellite communications for forces operating in the Arctic. Another good example is Operation Olympic Defender, which improves mission assurance and enhances collective resilience alongside Australian, British, Canadian allies. And in April, U.S. Space Command formally invited France, Germany, and New Zealand to participate in Olympic Defender moving forward. And exercises like Global Sentinel bring together multinational partners into a single venue to wrestle with and resolve space security issues. These efforts have been extraordinarily successful in expanding key partnerships by demonstrating and strengthening a multinational concept of operations. Each of our nations has its own respective capabilities in the space domain, its own strengths to share, whether that be in SATCOM, space domain awareness, launch, whatever else. By unifying and aligning that strength towards robust protect and defend activities, we can capitalize on our capabilities to enable deterrence. It is a matter of finding our form and giving it proper function. Unity of effort for collective defense that ensures a sustained and long-term advantage over anyone who might care to threaten it. So to summarize this long, drawn-out history class today, we touched on Thucydides and his doomed retelling of classical deterrence, Brodie and his modern recontextualization of nuclear deterrence, and how these influenced our development of competitive endurance. And finally, I discussed a collective need to focus on specific, tangible military capabilities and activities that allow us to protect and defend and ultimately secure our interests in, from, and to space. In the end, what I'm advocating for here is a change in focus and clarification of thought. Deterrence is the rightful and worthy province of our civilian and political leaders, and we must stand ready to support it. To do that effectively, I propose we design our forces and orchestrate our activities around military functions like protect and defend, which can more tangibly pursue rather than deterrence, which is more nebulous and complex concept. There are a number of areas where we are and where we can work together towards that goal. Areas like coordinated investments in visible defensive capabilities, tactics, and doctrine. Areas like mutual space domain awareness and data sharing. Areas like alliance building and defining and adhering to responsible behaviors in space. Together, we must foster an environment conducive to civil and commercial space activities. Together, we must find innovative ways to protect our space systems from attack and protect allied forces from space-enabled attack, targeting, and tracking. Together, we must delegitimize space activities that exacerbate the growth of orbital debris or put our space assets and the lives of our astronauts at risk. These are no small tasks, but the world is watching, both our friends and our adversaries, to judge how we collectively respond to challenges in these historic times. Looking around this room, I firmly believe we are up to this challenge. Thank you again for including me and allowing me to dive back in history. Thanks for inviting me here today, and I very much look forward to the discussion. Semper Supra. Thank you.